Hello, everyone. Before we start, hit that like button and subscribe. Drop a comment with where you are watching from and what time it is for you. That's how YouTube keeps sending you stories like this. And now, let's get into it. I never imagined that something as ordinary as taking out the garbage would become the moment everything in my quiet life shifted into a place I still struggle to understand. Even writing this in my head now, trying to piece together each detail in the order they happened, I keep circling back to that one evening last week when I saw Charles in his backyard with my shovel, digging like the ground itself had wronged him. To really explain why all of this has me so shaken, I have to start with the history between our houses. I've lived next door to Charles and his wife, Kathy, for a little over 10 years. For the first half of that time, they were what anyone would consider normal neighbors. They kept their yard neat, went to work on time, waved when they saw us, and every now and then invited us over for barbecues when the weather warmed up. Those gatherings were simple and friendly, the kind where nothing significant happens, but you go home feeling like you live in a stable, safe little neighborhood. 5 years ago, that stability cracked. Their son disappeared without a trace. He was 14. I still remember standing in their driveway that first night, the way the flashing red and blue lights from the patrol cars reflected off the windows of both our houses. Charles looked pale and jittery, pacing in short bursts like he couldn't figure out where to put his hands or what direction to face. Kathy stood completely still with her arms wrapped around herself, like she was trying to hold the pieces of her own body together. After that night, for weeks, reporters and volunteers came and went, searching the nearby woods and passing out flyers with the boys' school photo on it. Every time I looked at that picture, I imagined a kid who should have been worrying about homework, not becoming a face on the local news. When the searches stopped, the neighborhood slowly drifted back into its routine, but Charles and Kathy never did. They aged almost overnight. Kathy became quiet, almost withdrawn, avoiding eye contact and speaking only when she needed to. Charles was different in a more unpredictable way. He went from being an easygoing guy who joked about yard work to someone who always appeared tense, always watching people, always seeming as though something unsaid was weighing on him. Even at the barbecues they still insisted on hosting once or twice every summer, there was a heaviness in the air, like everything they were doing was just an imitation of how they used to be. I never once asked them if their son's body had been found. It felt too cruel to bring up, as if speaking the question out loud would force them to confirm something they weren't ready to say. My wife felt the same way. We tried to be supportive when we could, but after a while the subject just became a silent presence between our houses, something everyone sensed but no one touched. Last week, when Charles walked up to me and asked to borrow a shovel, it didn't strike me as unusual at first. People borrow tools from neighbors all the time. He approached me as I was dragging our garbage bin to the curb. He didn't look particularly upset, but he didn't look well either. He seemed tired in a way that wasn't just physical, like he hadn't been sleeping or had been carrying something around in his head for days. He didn't explain what he needed the shovel for, and I didn't ask. I just went to the garage, grabbed the good one, the sturdy steel one I only used for heavier yard work, and handed it to him. He thanked me and walked straight into his backyard, disappearing behind the fence. I went inside, washed my hands, and headed upstairs when I realized the window in the spare room gave me a clear view into his yard. I glanced out of habit, expecting to see him digging a small hole for a plant or some simple task. Instead, he was halfway through creating a large pit, the kind that required effort and determination and a reason. The dirt around him formed uneven mounds, and the hole itself was big enough that he had to step in and out of it. He wiped his forehead repeatedly, moving more slowly each minute, clearly struggling. Something in me felt guilty for watching, like I was invading his privacy. So I grabbed my second shovel and walked over to his yard with the intention of helping him finish. I thought he'd appreciate the offer. When I stepped inside his gate and called out to him, he jumped like I'd startled him awake from a trance. He dropped my shovel onto the dirt and hurried toward me so fast he almost stumbled. His expression didn't match anything I had ever seen on his face before. It was tense, almost panicked, as if I had walked into something I wasn't meant to witness. He didn't want my help. He didn't want me in his yard at all. He pointed toward the exit without saying anything else and stood there waiting for me to comply. I didn't argue. I didn't push him. Something in the way he stood there, rigid and unwilling to step aside, made it clear he needed me gone immediately. When I returned to my house, I went back upstairs to the same window. I told myself I was only watching because I was worried about him, but the truth is I was unsettled. His behavior wasn't something I could easily brush off. He continued digging slower and slower until he finally set the shovel down and looked around at all the surrounding houses. He scanned windows and rooftops. When his eyes reached mine, I realized too late that I hadn't moved away in time. I walked away from the window, pretending it was just coincidence that I happened to be there. From then on, I checked the yard every so often, expecting him to finish and cover the hole. But the space remained untouched, open like a raw wound in the middle of the grass. That night, well past midnight, the sound of metal striking dirt woke me. It was faint at first, like someone hitting a rhythm into the soil, but it grew clearer. I looked out the window, but the darkness swallowed the yard. The moon was bright enough to outline the fence, but not enough to show what he was doing. I slipped outside quietly, stepping carefully so the gravel wouldn't crunch under my feet. When I peeked over the fence, I could see him working in the dim light. He was digging deeper this time. His movements looked heavy, deliberate. I watched until he finished and went into his house. The moment he closed the back door, I knew I had only seconds if I wanted to see what was in that hole. I climbed into his yard, trying to make as little noise as possible, though every breath felt loud. The moonlight caught the edge of something at the bottom of the pit, a black garbage bag. A corner of it pushed upward through the loose soil. For a moment, all I could hear was my heartbeat pounding in my ears. My mind filled the silence with possibilities, none of them good. I kept looking at the bag, then at his back door, then back at the bag. My legs felt shaky, like they weren't convinced of what I was doing. In the end, I ran back to my yard without touching it. That decision might have saved me, because seconds later he stepped outside again, though he didn't return to the hole. Instead, he disappeared around the side of his house, out of view. I didn't wait to see what he was doing. I rushed inside, locked the door, and went straight to bed, lying still beside my wife, while my mind replayed everything on a loop. The next morning, the first thing I did was check the window. The hole was completely filled, smoothed over, almost perfect. Someone who didn't know better would never guess anything had been disturbed. His SUV was now parked on the street rather than the driveway, which was strange because he always parked it in the same spot near the garage. That detail bothered me more than it should have. It made me think he had loaded something into it during the night. I went through the day in a fog, unable to shake the feeling that I had almost uncovered something I wasn't meant to know. I didn't tell my wife. I didn't trust myself to talk about it without sounding unhinged. But the worst moment happened the following afternoon, when I glanced out the window and saw him standing in his own window across from mine. He wasn't doing anything. He wasn't moving. He was just staring directly into my window watching. When he realized I had noticed, he immediately closed the blinds. Nothing about that look felt accidental. It felt like a warning. Since then, he hasn't spoken to me. He hasn't come outside while I've been in view. He still hasn't returned my shovel, and I'm not about to go ask for it. I don't know what he buried or unburied that night, but the pieces are settling into a shape I can't ignore. A missing child. A man who changed after losing him. A secret buried deep enough no one was ever supposed to find it. And now, perhaps a fear that I saw more than I should have. I'm left with a terrible choice. If I report what I saw, I have nothing but suspicions. No evidence, no photos. Nothing. If I stay quiet, I'm carrying a truth that's pressing harder on my conscience every day. But the fear that keeps me up at night isn't about what was in the ground. It's about the man who knows I looked. It's about the blinds he closed. It's about the silence between our houses now, heavier than it ever was after his son disappeared. And it's about the simple, chilling realization that I don't think he's finished with whatever he started that night. I spent most of my childhood thinking nothing in my neighborhood could ever truly scare me. I knew every crack in the sidewalks, every tree root that pushed up through the grass, and every house light that flicked on at dusk. Everything felt predictable back then, and for the longest time I believed that predictable meant safe. But during those final months in our first home, when I was 15 and already counting down the days until we moved, something shifted in a way I never fully understood until years later. It was the first time I felt real fear connected to the people living right beside us. Ordinary people who looked no different from anyone else. Our family had never been close to the neighbors. We waved sometimes, but that was about it. My parents kept to themselves, and the two boys next door, Eric and Todd, did the same. They were nearly invisible for most of my childhood. I would see them sometimes in their yard or heading somewhere with their dad. But they hardly looked our way. Even with so little interaction, I still somehow knew their names. Maybe from hearing their dad call them inside or from school kids who vaguely mentioned them. They always seemed like the kind of kids who preferred to stay hidden, and for most of my life, I barely thought about them. Everything shifted late one afternoon when my younger brother and I were outside playing basketball in the driveway. The air was warm, the kind of soft, early, evening warmth that made the neighborhood feel calm and quiet. That was when Todd walked over. He had this strange energy about him, like he wasn't used to approaching people. But he came straight up anyway. I could tell right away that my brother felt awkward, so I did most of the responding. It was small talk at first, the kind of awkward, choppy exchange you'd expect from kids who barely knew each other. But the moment he mentioned us moving, it caught me off guard. I hadn't expected him to know anything about it, and I hadn't expected him to care enough to bring it up. At the end of that brief moment, he invited us to go out with him and Eric the next day to shoot BB guns down by the river. I didn't think much of it. It felt unexpected but harmless. It was the weekend, and boredom had a way of making anything sound like a plan. My brother quickly asked if he could come too, and Todd gave a quick nod before walking off. Even then, there was something about the way he turned away so abruptly that left me uneasy, but I ignored it. The next day, when the doorbell rang just before dusk, my brother and I answered fast. We didn't want our parents involved, especially because we hadn't mentioned anything about the plan. When we stepped outside and saw Todd and Eric fully dressed in camouflage, with a duffel bag slung between them, I felt something tighten in my stomach. It all felt a little too serious for what I imagined would be a casual thing. My brother and I shared a couple of nervous looks as we walked with them down the street. The two of them hardly spoke, moving ahead of us with this rigid focus that didn't make sense to me. Every now and then, I felt myself holding back louder just because the atmosphere was so strange. But the longer we walked, the more that amusement faded. When we got to the woods, it became clear just how little we knew them. Todd dropped the bag, unzipped it, and began pulling out guns. They looked different from what I expected. He handed one to me and another to my brother, and the moment he said they weren't BB guns, my stomach dropped. It was Eric who proved it by grabbing one, aiming at a tree, and firing across the river. The sound of the shot cracked the air in a way that didn't feel real at first. My brother flinched. I felt my pulse pounding, fear rising so quickly it made everything around me feel too sharp. I took both guns back from my brother and placed them into the duffel bag. My hands were shaking, but I tried not to show it. I don't know why, but I didn't feel safe arguing or reacting too strongly. I only said that we weren't comfortable and that we needed to leave. They stopped and stared at us, and even with the fading daylight, I could see something in their expressions that made me want to get out of there as quickly as possible. As we walked away, I could feel their eyes on us. One of them shouted something behind us, but I was too focused on getting my brother home safely to fully process the words. That night at dinner, my brother and I said only that they were strange kids. We didn't say anything about the guns. I didn't want to worry my parents, and I convinced myself it wasn't worth making a big deal over since we would be moving soon. But that choice became one I regretted more than almost anything else. I woke up in the early hours of the morning to cold air hitting my face. My window, which had been shut when I went to sleep, was open all the way. I remember staring out into the darkness, confused and trying to make sense of what I was looking at, when I suddenly felt something hard press against the back of my head. I froze so completely it felt like my body stopped existing for a moment. I didn't scream. I didn't jump. My mind seemed to go strangely still, like a protective numbness washed over me. I recognized Todd's low whisper instantly. He threatened me, and the words were sharp enough that they embedded themselves in my mind. In a way I can still recall word for word even now. Then he was gone, slipping out the window the same way he had come in. I stayed frozen for minutes after he left, barely breathing, trying to convince myself I was awake. When I finally got up, I closed the window and locked it. My hands were shaking so badly, I had to hold the frame for a moment just to steady myself. I didn't tell anyone the next morning. I didn't tell my brother. I didn't tell my parents. I didn't trust my voice to even explain it. From that night on, things changed. Every night, practically without fail, one of the boys would appear at a window on their house and stare toward ours. Sometimes it was Todd. Sometimes it was Eric. Sometimes it was both. I could tell they were watching either my room or my brother's because their house lined up in such a way that their bedroom windows faced ours almost directly. I never told my brother what had happened that night, but I could tell he sensed something was wrong because he slept more lightly and always seemed on edge. I didn't want him to carry fear on top of everything else, especially since we were so close to moving. As the moving date got closer, things escalated. About a week before we left, I woke to a loud clack against my window. A rock had hit the glass. When I looked outside, Todd was standing in the yard, aiming a pistol upward. My entire body locked. I dropped to the floor, heart hammering so fast it hurt. Then I heard the sound of laughter. Sharp, ugly laughter that cut through the night. They said things loudly enough for me to hear. Insults meant to sting and intimidate. I stayed on the floor for a long time, waiting for them to leave, barely able to breathe. There were 2 more incidents that same week. Quick moments of harassment that left me and my brother nervous every time we stepped outside. And because the moving date was so close, I held on to the idea of escape like it was the only thing keeping me sane. When moving day finally arrived, I remember feeling a deep, overwhelming relief that almost knocked the wind out of me. For the first time in months, stepping outside didn't make my skin crawl. My parents had no idea why I was so eager to leave, but I didn't care. I just wanted to get away. Years later, my brother and I talked about those last months and admitted to each other that neither of us had told anyone. He hadn't known about the window incident, but he had his own stories of seeing them watching him. Those boys were trouble from the beginning, but back then I didn't realize just how dangerous they truly were. We left at the perfect time. Any longer, and I don't like imagining what might have happened. Even now, when I think back to that house, the memories feel cold. Not because of ghosts or anything supernatural, but because of how real everything was. How close I came to believing that those same walls that kept my family safe for 15 years could have easily become the place where something irreversible happened. Leaving that neighborhood wasn't just moving, it was escaping. And I've never once looked back with anything but relief. I moved into this house because it was the only place I could afford after college. I told myself it was temporary, just a year or 2 while I saved enough to move somewhere better. The area was cheap for a reason. The houses were old and crowded together in a way that always felt claustrophobic, with cracked driveways and chain link fences patched together with zip ties. Every night I heard something through the walls, either the bass from the neighbors on one side or the unpredictable bursts of noise from the house on the other. I didn't expect comfort here, but I didn't expect the kind of tension that would follow me around my own home like a shadow either. On one side, it was constant music. Not normal loud music, but the kind where the walls vibrated and my window frames ticked from the bass. They partied on weeknights, weekends, early mornings, didn't matter. If I wanted silence, I had to leave the house. On the other side, things were different. Things were unsettling. That house belonged to two women whose relationship I never really understood. One looked to be in her 60s, with gray hair cut short around her face. Her expressions were always harsh, like her face didn't remember how to relax. The other woman was younger, probably in her 30s, and clearly had some kind of severe mental disability. I didn't know whether they were related, or if one was a caretaker. There was never anyone else visiting, never any explanations offered, and I didn't have the courage or desire to find out by asking. Most afternoons, I sat on my front porch trying to get a little fresh air, since the inside of my house felt stuffy and stale, no matter how often I cleaned. Every so often I would hear something from next door. It always began the same way, a sharp cry, almost animal, like, followed by the sound of feet stomping against the wooden floor inside. Then the rocking would begin. I could see the younger woman through the window sometimes, just a glimpse, moving quickly forward and back with her arms crossed tightly over her chest. Sometimes she pointed in my direction, eyes glazed and unfocused, while the older woman fought to hold her in place. It wasn't anger, not exactly. It was more like panic, or distress, or something else I didn't have a name for but didn't want directed at me. Whenever I noticed the younger woman fix her attention on me for too long, I went back inside. It felt safer not to be seen. 2 weeks ago, I had one of the worst workdays I'd had in months. All I wanted was sleep. I went to bed earlier than usual, hoping I could rest before the usual neighborhood noise kicked up. The room felt unusually warm, and I lay there waiting for the air in the house to cool down. That was when the noise started. Not the usual muffled sounds from next door. This time it was worse. The younger woman's screaming was relentless, broken and high-pitched, mixed with the older woman's strained voice. Furniture scraped across a floor. Something slammed repeatedly. For almost an hour, I listened to it from my bed, trying to convince myself to get up and do something, while also hoping it would simply stop on its own. It didn't stop. Eventually, frustration won over caution. I walked outside, crossed the narrow strip of grass between our houses, and banged on their front door. I didn't really think it through. The older woman opened it with a look that made my stomach sink, before I even said anything. She stared as if my existence was already a problem. The younger woman was still in the background, pacing and rocking, and the moment she noticed me, she started shouting at the older woman, her voice rising until it hurt to hear. The door shut in my face with a force that made the frame rattle. I walked back to my house feeling oddly embarrassed, as though I had done something wrong just by asking for quiet. But when I lay back in bed, the house next door suddenly went silent. No more screaming, no more thumps, nothing. I was relieved enough that I didn't question it. I fell asleep quickly. The next thing I remember was waking up and seeing the red glow of 3:00 a.m. on my clock. I felt like I had only just closed my eyes. I rolled over, tried to settle back into sleep, but then I heard something faint from downstairs. Not a clear noise, just the suggestion of movement. A shift in the air. A floorbird with a different sound than the ones that responded to the house settling. I sat up and waited, holding my breath. Nothing else followed. Eventually, I convinced myself it was part of a dream, or the house reacting to the warm night. 20 minutes later, I woke up again. No sound, no clear reason for waking, just a sharp jolt pulling me out of sleep. The room was darker than usual, like the shadows had thickened. I reached blindly for my phone on the nightstand, not turning it on yet, just holding it in case I needed it. I sat up slowly, letting my eyes adjust, scanning each corner of the room. Everything seemed empty. The walls, the closet door, the dark space by the dresser. No movement. Then I heard breathing. Not my own, a soft, shaky sound coming from directly beside the bed. I turned my head slightly, not daring to move too fast, and at first I didn't understand what I was looking at. It was just a shape against the wooden frame of my bed, darker than the rest of the room. A circular shape, unmoving. I lifted my phone and tapped the screen just enough for the faintest glow to spill onto the shape. It was a face. Her face. The younger woman from next door. Her eyes were wide, reflecting the light in a way that made them look hollow and frantic. Her lips were pressed tightly together and her whole body was tense, like she had been crouched there for a long time, waiting for me to notice her. The moment the light touched her, she reacted violently, her breath exploding into a jagged, sharp sound that felt more like a startled shriek than anything human. I scrambled out of the bed, stumbled, hit the floor, and clambered toward the door. She moved after me, fast and uneven, hitting her knees and hands against the floor with loud thumps. I managed to slam the bedroom door shut just as she reached the threshold. Her fists hit the wood again and again, each strike trembling through the frame. Her voice rose into a stream of shrill, broken sounds that made it hard to think clearly. I ran downstairs and locked the door that separated the upper floor from the lower one. My hands were shaking so badly that I dropped my phone twice before I could call the police. While I waited, I stood pressed against the front door listening to the pounding above me. Her voice was raw, strained, not forming actual words, just a frantic barrage of sounds. When the officers arrived, the noise stopped suddenly. The older woman appeared moments later, her expression twisting into something sharp and cold as soon as she saw me pointing toward my house. The police took the younger woman away for the night. They asked whether I wanted to press charges. I didn't. I didn't want to escalate anything. I felt exhausted, shaken, and just wanted the night to end. But the older woman stared at me with a hatred so intense it felt like a warning. Then she left, only to get in her car and drive off minutes later, leaving me in the aftermath of everything that had just happened. Since then, the house next door has been even quieter, but not in a comforting way, more like a pause before something resumes. I've started leaving lights on at night. I changed the locks even though I still don't know how she got inside in the first place. The thought of sleeping in that bedroom makes my stomach twist. I know I need to move. I know staying here isn't worth the fear that now colors every night. The faces next door, the one filled with hatred and the other filled with something I still can't understand, linger in my mind day after day. I can't ignore the feeling that the older woman blames me for what happened, or the fact that the younger woman found a way into my house once. That alone is enough to keep me awake at night. I've already started looking for another place, even if it means moving farther from work or taking on a higher rent. The neighborhood was never ideal, but now it feels dangerous in a way that has nothing to do with crime rates or noise complaints. It's personal. It's too close. And every time I walk past the window facing their house, I can't shake the sense that someone on the other side is watching, waiting, and remembering exactly what happened that night. My name is Garrett, and the only reason I still think about this story is because it actually happened. Nothing about it felt cinematic or exaggerated while it unfolded. It felt ordinary in the worst way, like something that could happen to anyone who ends up in the wrong living arrangement at the wrong time. I was a sophomore in college, and because I didn't get a dorm after freshman year, I had scrambled for off-campus housing. The search was desperate and rushed, because every place near campus filled up fast. I eventually landed in a co-op that was part of a three-house cluster shoved between a row of older apartment buildings and a run-down residential street. It wasn't close to campus, but I had a bike, and the rent was cheap enough to justify everything that seemed inconvenient. Most people living there were students like me, young, busy, juggling classes and part-time work. A few older people lived there too, the kind who were finishing degrees later in life, or teaching assistants saving money by living cheaply. The only person who didn't fit that mold at all was a woman who appeared to be in her late 50s or maybe early 60s. Her hair was gray in uneven streaks, and she walked with a faint but noticeable limp, favoring her right side like her lower back or hip hurt constantly. She never smiled, never laughed, and never reacted to anything around her. Her expression always looked empty, as if she were watching a distant point no one else could see. I didn't know which of the three houses she lived in, and nobody seemed eager to explain. I figured she was affiliated with the university somehow, maybe faculty or some kind of long-term resident, but no one volunteered details, and I wasn't comfortable asking too much so early. The first time she startled me was in the shared kitchen. Only one of the three houses used that space, because the other two had their own kitchens, so it made no sense that she was in ours. I walked in during the usual chaos of people rushing to cook before late classes. Music was playing, the windows were fogged from boiling pots, and everyone moved around each other in a way that felt familiar. She stood in the corner behind the fridge door, motionless, not eating or cooking or holding anything. She just watched. Her eyes stayed fixed on the activity, slow and unblinking, as if she didn't want anything except to stand in the center of the noise without being part of it. When I looked at her directly, she didn't look away. Her gaze stayed steady, like she had been waiting for me to notice. At first, I assumed she was zoning out, but each time I glanced again, her eyes were still locked on me. Nobody else in the kitchen reacted to her presence. It was as if they had silently agreed not to acknowledge her at all. A few days later, while working in my room, I saw her again through my window. I had looked up by chance, stretching after staring at my laptop too long. She stood in the middle of the street in the cold evening air. Her posture was stiff, shoulders slightly hunched, hands dangling loosely at her sides. She was staring up toward my window. I couldn't tell if she was looking exactly at me or at the house itself, but the sight of her standing directly under the streetlight made my stomach tighten. I made the mistake of raising my hand slightly in a friendly gesture. The reaction was immediate and unsettling. She bounced on her toes twice, like a child who had been given permission to run, and then sprinted off toward one of the other houses without hesitation. The movement was too quick for how frail she looked, and I felt sick with regret the moment she disappeared from view. If she hadn't been watching me before, I had given her a reason to start. That night I asked one of my housemates if he knew anything about her. He told me that she had been around forever, and that the safest thing to do was ignore her like everyone else. It sounded like something he had memorized instead of actually believed. I asked more questions around the houses over the next few days. Most people had only secondhand answers, but eventually, one senior who lived in her house told me she was associated with the university and was odd but harmless. He said she had never hurt anyone or caused problems, and the property manager was the only one who decided who lived where, so the rest of them simply accepted it. I wanted to believe she was harmless. I really did. I tried to focus on classes and work and not think about her. But then small things started happening. I would leave my room and turn into the hallway, only to find her standing near my door, close enough that I almost collided with her. This always happened late at night, long after most residents had gone quiet. She never reacted to nearly running into me. She would just turn and walk away with that same blank posture, as if wandering through the house was part of her nightly routine. Other times I'd catch glimpses of her in places she had no reason to be. Hovering near the laundry room, moving slowly down the back stairwell, or standing at the foot of the hallway staring in the direction of the bedrooms. Then my room key disappeared. Every room in the co-op still had the locks from when the place had been a hotel decades ago. Most people kept their doors unlocked because losing a key was a hassle, but I wasn't comfortable sleeping in an unlocked room. I tore my entire room apart looking for the key, but it was gone. I had a spare, but replacing the original would cost money I didn't have. A few nights after the key vanished, I woke up at around 3 in the morning for no clear reason. My room was dark except for the glow coming through the blinds from the street lamp outside. I lay still, trying to figure out what had woken me, and then I heard it, a soft bump from inside my closet, spaced out in slow intervals. It sounded like something shifting, like weight brushing against the door from the inside. My first instinct was disbelief, followed by fear that spread in my chest like heat. But I forced myself to move. I got out of bed quietly and walked slowly across the room. My breathing felt loud in my own ears. My hand hovered over the closet handle for a full second before I pulled it open all at once. She was crouched inside. She had wrapped one of my ties around her neck like a loose scarf. Her eyes were wide open, fixed directly on mine. In her other hand, she held a kitchen knife, the kind we kept in the drawer by the sink downstairs. The air inside the closet smelled stale and warm from her breath. Before I could react further, she lunged. I stumbled backward, yelling without meaning to, and felt the impact of her small frame hitting my torso. She swung the knife wildly, but her movements were weak and uncoordinated. I grabbed her wrists and forced the knife out of her hand. Her body thrashed erratically, her limbs jerking with sudden bursts of energy. I pinned her to the floor using all my weight, feeling her legs kicking uselessly against my shins. Her breath came out in sharp bursts, but her face stayed expressionless even as she struggled. The commotion woke the house. Doors slammed open, feet pounded down the hall, and two of my housemates helped hold her down until the police arrived. They found my missing room key in her pocket. The realization that she had used it to enter my room while I slept made my skin crawl. The aftermath felt like a long fog. She never spoke a word, not to me, not to the police, not to anyone. The explanation came later. She was the property manager's sister. He had been letting her live there secretly in one of the empty rooms because she needed care he couldn't provide. Instead of finding help for her, he had put her in a community where nobody knew how to handle the situation. He was arrested for negligence among other charges. Sometimes I think about her crouched in that closet with my tie wrapped around her throat. I don't know what she wanted or why she became fixated on me. The thought that she had been entering my room before that night still makes my chest tighten. I'm graduating soon. I'll miss a lot about college, but I know that whenever I think about that co-op, the first image that comes to mind will always be her face staring up at me from the shadows inside my own closet. I have lived in this neighborhood long enough to watch entire families grow up, move out, and be replaced by new ones. Our house sits on a quiet street lined with maples and aging fences, the kind of place where the mail carrier knows everyone by name and people tend to stay put once they settle in. Benjamin and I bought this house when our kids were young, and by the time they all moved out, we had grown used to the space being quieter. I spent a lot of time on the front porch once I retired, usually with a book or some knitting, sometimes just watching the way the afternoon light hit the pavement. I liked the calm, but the empty house across the street had become an eyesore. It was a perfectly good two-story place with a decent yard, but no one had lived there for almost 2 years. Every time I looked up from my chair, there it was. Windows dark, yard unkept, paint slowly wearing down. So when I saw a moving truck pull up one warm afternoon last spring, I felt a sense of relief. A new neighbor meant new life on the street. The young man who moved and looked to be in his mid-20s. He drove a shiny black BMW that stood out on the street more than he probably realized. His clothes were sharp, clean, and always expensive looking, the kind you'd expect from someone with a high salary or parents with deep pockets. But he didn't carry himself like someone trying to intimidate. He had an earnest face, the kind that softened whenever he smiled. I saw him unloading boxes and setting them on the driveway before carrying them inside. He moved quickly, as if he was used to doing everything alone. For the first few days he kept to himself, coming and going at odd hours, but eventually he waved to me from across the street. The wave was small and almost shy. I waved back from my porch. After a few days he introduced himself while Benjamin was outside with me. His name was Quinn, just a few years out of college, working some kind of job in entertainment or media. The explanation didn't make much sense to me, but it must have paid well enough judging by his car and clothes. He was friendly and sharp, and he seemed genuinely interested in whatever Benjamin said to him. Benjamin liked him right away, and over the next few weeks, their casual waves from driveway to driveway turned into short moments of connection, the kind you get in neighborhoods like ours where nobody wants to intrude, but everyone likes to feel friendly. For the first few months, everything felt normal. Quinn settled into a routine. I noticed he left early most mornings and often came home late in the evening. I never saw parties or large gatherings at his house. He kept the yard trimmed, the lights timed perfectly, the trash cans pulled out and back in without fail. I appreciated the reliability of it. It made me feel like the street was alive again. But then I began noticing the girl. She arrived in a white convertible that was almost always spotless. She was young, maybe even younger than Quinn, with long blonde hair that she often pulled into a high ponytail. She wore clothes that seemed more suited for beaches and nightclubs than for our quiet residential street. Whenever she swung out of her little car, she walked with that certain quickness that comes from knowing you look good and wanting to be seen. The first time I saw her, she unlocked Quinn's front door with a key of her own, went inside, and stayed for maybe an hour before leaving again. At first, I assumed she was his girlfriend. Young people live differently now. Coming and going at odd hours seemed normal enough for them. But the pattern continued. I would be knitting or reading or just enjoying the weather when her car would pull up even though Quinn wasn't home. She would let herself in, stay for some time, then leave. Sometimes she looked flustered or distracted. Once I saw her rushing out with her hair messy and her clothes twisted as though she had changed in a hurry. I didn't think much of it at first, but over time it became clear that whatever relationship she and Quinn had, it wasn't smooth. Weeks later, I saw them together for the first time. Quinn had driven her home in the BMW. They stepped out and walked up the path to his front door. He held himself calmly, but she moved like someone bursting with energy that had nowhere to go. After that day, the tension around them seemed to build. I could sense it in the way Quinn lingered in his driveway after she left, rubbing his forehead as if trying to settle himself. Something was off. The argument happened on an afternoon when I was tending to the small garden beside my porch. The sun was bright, the air sticky, and I could hear every sharp noise from across the street. I heard raised voices first, hers louder than his, and when I looked up, they were standing in the middle of Quinn's driveway. She gestured wildly, her face twisted with anger. She stepped closer to him, invading his space with the kind of boldness that comes from feeling absolutely justified. He stood still with his hands low, almost rigid. I couldn't hear the exact words, and I wouldn't have wanted to, but the tone alone told me enough. She was furious. He was cornered. Eventually, she stormed to her car, slammed the door, and sped away, tires screeching slightly as she went down the road. Quinn stayed there for a few seconds and then went into the house. He looked exhausted. He didn't notice me at all. I told Benjamin what I'd seen, but he reminded me that I shouldn't pry. He was right, of course. I had no reason to get involved in the private conflicts of people I barely knew. Still, the image stuck with me. The next time I saw her car parked in his driveway, while he was gone, something felt different. The hairs on my arms prickled despite the calm weather. It was just a few weeks later that everything went wrong. Benjamin and I were asleep when the sirens pierced the quiet of the night. I woke up immediately, heart pounding, and shook him awake. By the time we both hurried outside, half the neighborhood had already gathered in small clusters along the curb. Police cars lined the street. An ambulance sat in Quinn's driveway. Red and blue lights flashed across the windows of the surrounding homes, giving the whole street an eerie, fragmented glow. I saw officers walking in and out of Quinn's house, their radios crackling. Then 2 officers emerged with the blonde girl. She was in handcuffs. She looked straight ahead, expression blank, her movements stiff and calm. I had expected yelling, crying, something dramatic, but she moved as if detached from the moment. The sight of her being guided into a police car felt surreal. Moments later, paramedics wheeled Quinn out on a stretcher. I saw blood, deep, dark patches covering parts of his shirt and arms. His face was pale and tight with pain, his eyes barely open. I gasped before I could stop myself. Benjamin put a hand on my shoulder, steadying me. I watched them lift Quinn into the ambulance and close the doors. The truck pulled away with its lights spinning silently. The siren off now that they had him stabilized. We waited outside with our neighbors until the police finished their work. No one knew the full story yet. We only knew something violent and terrible had happened inside that house. A week passed before we saw Quinn again. When he finally returned home, he looked thin and shaken, moving slowly as though unsure of his footing. Benjamin and I walked over with the intention of offering a simple welcome back, nothing intrusive. Quinn led us inside. The house looked exactly the same, but he didn't. His hands trembled slightly as he spoke. Without giving us many details, he explained what had happened in a quiet, steady way, as if he'd already repeated it too many times to feel anything anymore. The girl, Ellie, had stolen his spare house key months earlier and made her own copy. The visits I had seen from my porch had been planned invasions. She had gone through his belongings, monitored his routines, and tracked his location through his phone. something I didn't even know was possible. Every time she appeared while he was gone, she was tending to hidden cameras she had planted around his house, checking batteries and making sure nothing had been moved. She had watched his private life in real time, convincing herself she deserved control over it. The argument I had witnessed was during his attempt to end the relationship. She had refused and left the house in a rage. The next night, fueled by what she saw through those cameras and whatever narrative she had built in her head, she returned with a knife. Quinn woke up to her standing in his room. The attack happened fast. He managed to fight back long enough to subdue her, but not before she seriously injured him. The doctor had told him he was less than an inch away from needing emergency surgery or worse. He told us that he regretted flaunting his money. He regretted taking her at face value. He regretted not seeing the warnings sooner. I could see the fear in his eyes, the way it clung to him like something that wouldn't wash off. Benjamin and I tried to comfort him, but it was clear the house itself had become a reminder he couldn't live with. Within a month, he had packed up and moved out. One afternoon, his car pulled away for the last time, leaving the driveway empty again. The house across the street returned to its stillness, but it didn't feel like before. The memory of flashing lights and the image of Quinn on that stretcher stayed in my mind longer than I expected. I found myself sitting on my porch without the same peace I once felt. I kept glancing toward that house, knowing what had happened inside and how close he had come to losing his life. I still think about Quinn sometimes. I hope he found somewhere safer, somewhere quieter, somewhere that lets him sleep through the night without fear. Knowing that Young should learn so violently how dangerous another person's obsession can be. I pray he is all right wherever he is. I moved into my new place hoping to rebuild parts of my life I didn't like to talk about anymore. The move wasn't some exciting restart. It was something I forced on myself after making stupid decisions with money and even worse decisions with people. I had spent enough time around the wrong kind of women and the wrong crowd. And when things finally blew up with my ex, staying in my old city became impossible. I took what was left of my savings and bought a house in a quiet area far enough away that no one I used to associate with would ever think to look for me. It was the kind of neighborhood where people jogged after work, waved politely when they took out their trash, and kept their lawns trimmed in perfect squares. Most houses were spread out with generous gaps of property between them, which was something I wanted more than I realized. For some reason, the house right next to mine was built much closer than all the others. It was a massive place, 3 stories tall with wide windows and a wraparound porch that looked like something a large family would grow into. When I first toured my own place, I wondered if maybe the huge house next door belonged to a family of 10 or some extended group with grandparents, aunts, and cousins all living under one roof. It was the only explanation that made sense for something that size. Once I settled in, I made a point to introduce myself to everyone on the street except for the people in that big house. It wasn't intentional at first, I just kept saving them for last. I couldn't explain why. Maybe it was laziness, or maybe I just assumed a house that size had someone intimidating living inside, someone who wouldn't care about meeting me. The rest of the neighbors turned out to be almost uniformly kind and successful. Most were older than me, with young kids and polished careers. I felt awkward being single and not quite 30, with no wife, no kids, and too much free time. I told myself it didn't matter, but the feeling still lingered. When I finally walked over to the next door house, I expected someone middle-aged to answer. Instead, a guy who looked like he could have been a few years younger than me opened the door. He had a mullet and a kind of effortless confidence that caught me off guard. I had spent the entire day meeting people who felt like they belonged in a real estate brochure, and suddenly I was standing in front of someone who looked like he spent half his time on a couch with a beer in hand. It threw me off enough that I almost forgot what I had planned to say. His name was Damon, and from the moment I met him, he struck me as one of those people who acted like every day was Saturday afternoon. He smiled in a way that made him appear excited to see someone his own age in a neighborhood full of parents. He seemed friendly, relaxed, and easy to talk to. He invited me to get drinks sometime, but when I jokingly suggested we hang out right then and there, he stiffened slightly and looked behind him, like he didn't want me to see something inside his house. He brushed it off with an excuse about being busy with work, and when I asked what he did, he hesitated before telling me he worked in finance. It didn't sound convincing, but I didn't pry. The strangest part of our conversation was learning that he lived in that enormous house alone. I couldn't wrap my head around that. I knew I barely fit comfortably in my much smaller place, and he said it like it was completely normal. We traded numbers, chatted a bit more, and eventually I headed home feeling relieved that someone close to my age lived next door. I figured we'd eventually become friends. That was 6 months ago. For the first few weeks, nothing happened. I sent him a few texts here and there to try setting up a time to hang out, but he always replied with excuses about being busy or working late. The messages sounded polite but distant, like he was trying to keep space without being rude. I didn't push it. What bothered me more was how little he seemed to actually live in his house. His car was always in the driveway, but I never once saw him leave or return. He didn't get groceries delivered, didn't receive takeout, and never had guests. He didn't even take out trash. The house sat there silently day after day, and if it wasn't for the occasional light turning on at night, I would have assumed the place was empty. I work from home in my third-floor office, and from the window I had a clear view of his driveway and most of his yard. I didn't go out of my way to look, but every time I took a screen break, my eyes drifted over almost automatically. Part of it was curiosity. Another part was the uneasy feeling of having a stranger living that close with no visible routine. One night, on a Wednesday around 2 in the morning, I woke up to the sound of loud music, not faint noise. The kind of bass, heavy music you feel in your ribs. I sat up, disoriented, unsure if I was dreaming, but the sound kept going, so I got out of bed and looked out the window. Damon's driveway was packed with cars. 7 at least. The house was lit up like a weekend rager, and the music was blasting as if someone dragged speakers onto the lawn. It didn't fit anything I knew about him. I hadn't seen anyone go into his house in months. I figured the respectful thing to do was walk over and ask him to lower the volume. Not angrily, just enough so I could get some sleep. I threw on clothes and crossed the lawn. When I reached the door, I knocked, expecting someone to stumble out or shout something back. Nothing happened. I knocked again harder. Still nothing. I tried the handle. The door opened instantly. Inside, there was a pile of shoes in the foyer, at least 10 pairs. But the house itself was empty. Completely empty. The lights were on, the music thundered through the speakers, but there were no people anywhere. No drinks, no spilled food, no jackets tossed on couches. Nothing to indicate an actual gathering. That was when I realized what I was hearing wasn't real. The clinking glasses, the bursts of laughter, the loud mix of voices. It wasn't live sound. It was a recording. A loud, perfect recording of a party. Before I could wrap my mind around that, a faint mechanical noise hummed from deeper inside the house. It wasn't music related. It sounded like a heavy industrial machine cycling, something grinding in slow, steady intervals. I followed the noise through the open layout until I reached a basement door propped slightly open. A dim, cold light leaked from below. I felt something wrong in that moment, but I went down anyway, one step at a time. The smell hit me halfway down, sharp, chemical, sterile. Something like concentrated bleach or disinfectant, mixed with something metallic underneath. At the bottom of the stairs, another room glowed faintly through a cracked door. I moved close enough to peer inside without revealing myself. 3 older men stood inside the room, facing something I couldn't see from my angle. They wore thick work gloves, protective goggles, and heavy-duty clothing, the kind people wore for industrial cleanup jobs. Their boots were coated in something dark, and they stood too still, too focused on whatever was in front of them. None of them looked like Damon. I didn't understand what I was witnessing, but every instinct told me I needed to leave immediately. The situation didn't feel like some misunderstanding. It felt dangerous in a way I had no frame of reference for. I turned away from the door, moving as quietly as possible up the stairs. I was halfway up when the light behind me suddenly dimmed, as if someone had shut the inner door. I didn't hear it over the blast of the fake party recording, but I felt the shift of light and air. Panic hit me hard. I sprinted the rest of the way up, bolted out the front door, and cut across my yard, climbing my fence instead of using my walkway. Back in my house, I locked every door and went upstairs to my office. I kept the lights off and crouched under the window, lifting my head just enough to look across at Damon's property. After a few minutes, the front door of his house burst open and a group of 8 men stormed outside. All older, all dressed like the ones in the basement. They scanned the driveway, the yards, the street. They looked agitated, pointing and moving around as if arguing intensely. Damon was nowhere among them. Eventually, they went back inside, and the recording shut off. The house turned silent again. The next morning, Damon's car disappeared. It was gone when I woke up, and it didn't return that day or the next. His house went dark, and the untouched shoes and cars from the night before weighed on my mind. I tried asking a few neighbors if they had heard the music. Every single one of them said they hadn't heard anything at all. Even the family 2 houses down with a baby monitor running at all hours. That made no sense. The music had been loud enough to shake my window. Weeks passed. Damon never returned. His grass grew higher, deliveries piled up by the door, and not a single person went in or out. I watched the house slowly fall into neglect, while the rest of the neighborhood stayed picture perfect. I kept thinking about the men in the basement, the chemical smell, the fake party noise, the unlocked door. I didn't know if the shoes belonged to missing people or workers or something else entirely, and I didn't want to guess. I knew only one thing for sure. Whatever was happening inside that house was never meant for anyone living on that street to see or hear. I considered reporting it, but I had no evidence that would make sense to police. I wasn't willing to risk being wrong or being right. Both felt equally dangerous. A month later, with Damon still gone and the house looking abandoned, I made the decision to start the process of moving again. Not urgently, but steadily. I didn't tell anyone why. I didn't want another situation spiraling into something I couldn't walk away from. I keep an eye on that empty house every day until the sun sets. I don't know where Damon went or whether he's alive. I don't know who the older men were or what they were doing in his basement in the middle of the night. All I know is that for the rest of my life, I will never open another neighbor's door again. Even if it's unlocked, even if the noise inside sounds like something familiar, even if I think I'm helping. When the new neighbor first appeared, I honestly thought it was going to be an improvement. My wife and I had never gotten along with the previous people in that house, so seeing a plain white van in the driveway felt like a clean slate. What struck me as odd from the beginning, though, was the way he moved in. There were no moving trucks, no furniture deliveries, no signs of anyone carrying boxes inside. One night the driveway was empty, and the next morning the van was just there, parked straight and neat, as if it had always belonged beside that house. We decided to introduce ourselves, mostly to avoid another cold neighborly relationship. The house looked lived in from the outside, and the van was parked right in front of the garage door, so we figured he had to be home. We knocked several times, waited, knocked again. Nothing. There wasn't the faintest sound from inside the house. No footsteps, no muffled movement, not even a shadow crossing near the door. It felt strangely hollow, like knocking on an empty house, except the vehicle outside said otherwise. Eventually we gave up and convinced ourselves that maybe he was asleep or showering or simply ignoring the sound. Our bedroom window looks directly into the neighbor's backyard, which has a detached garage sitting near the back fence. For the first few days, the van didn't move at all, and no one came or left. Then one night, after my wife and I had gone upstairs to read, we heard the rattle of a garage door opening next door. It was late enough that the silence made the mechanical sound stand out more than usual. Out of pure curiosity, we nudged open the blinds just enough to see through the sliver. The motion light over the garage flipped on and exposed a man moving between the van and the open garage. He looked like he was in his 40s or 50s, with short hair, a plain white t-shirt, and faded jeans. He lifted boxes from the van with the slow, methodical movements of someone trying not to make noise, even though it was obvious he wasn't succeeding. We only watched for a short moment, just enough to get an impression of him, then let the blinds fall back into place. We didn't want to look like nosy neighbors. A few days went by, and once again the van stayed gone all day. At some point late that night, we heard the garage door open again, followed by strange scraping sounds. They were steady and metallic, persistent enough that it didn't sound like someone dropping a box or shifting tools. It almost sounded like something heavy being dragged against a rough surface. Every so often there would be a single loud bang, as if an object had fallen over. At first I tried to ignore it, but the rhythm of it, slow and irregular, began to gnaw at me. I finally went to the window again, moving the blinds just enough to see down into the neighbor's yard. As soon as I looked out, the man lifted his head and stared straight up toward me. His face didn't move at all, not a twitch or a blink. I felt a sharp jolt of embarrassment and stepped away from the window instantly. Seconds later, I heard his garage door slam shut. The guilt of being caught watching pushed me toward doing something about it. I figured I could smooth the awkwardness by stepping outside and saying hello, maybe even make a normal introduction. When I got out there, the van was already running. He was sitting inside with the headlights off. The moment he saw me approaching through the dim light, the van jerked backward and shot down the driveway faster than anyone normally reversed. Within seconds, he was gone, swallowed by the night. The entire encounter felt deliberate in a way that didn't sit right with me. His effort to avoid us seemed extreme, and the noises I kept hearing began to stir up a sense of unease. Curiosity doesn't always lead to good decisions, but it pushed me into his backyard that night. I walked along the side of his house, into the narrow pathway that opened up beside the detached garage. The motion light didn't turn on for me. The interior of the garage was dark, but there were thumps coming from inside. Subtle, uneven, but impossible to ignore. They were too irregular to be mechanical. They sounded like something shifting around in there, something alive. Before I could do anything else, my wife's voice came sharply from our bedroom window, cutting through the moment. She demanded to know what I was doing outside. The shock of being caught in such an intrusive act snapped me back to reality. I tried the garage door once, found it locked, and hurried back home. I felt stupid for sneaking around, but something about the sounds wouldn't let me dismiss them entirely. Later that same night, my wife shook me awake. She said she heard our backyard gate being opened. At first I thought she was half asleep or imagining things, but she was insistent. I listened and heard nothing, but the tension in her voice pushed me to get up. I checked the window, but the darkness outside swallowed everything. I went downstairs anyway, looked through the front door's glass panel, and noticed the van was finally back in the neighbor's driveway. That didn't make me feel any better. I went to the backyard and turned on the porch lights. As soon as I did, I heard someone sprinting across the side of our house. The gate slammed shut with a hard metallic clap. For a moment I froze, unable to make sense of the sudden burst of panic inside me. Then anger took over, pushing me to chase whoever it was. I ran out to the gate, then around the front, then to the street. But the night was empty. Everything appeared normal, except for that crawling feeling that someone was hidden in the shadows watching me. I returned inside and told my wife what happened. She asked if I thought it was the neighbor. I honestly didn't know, but the timing felt too close to be unrelated. The next morning I asked Gene, the neighbor 2 doors down, if he had ever met the new guy. He said he hadn't, but admitted he often heard strange noises coming from that garage late at night. That made my stomach drop, because now it wasn't just us imagining things. I told him about someone sneaking into our yard. He looked genuinely disturbed and said he would keep an ear out. We agreed that if either of us heard something again, we'd go together to figure out what was going on. I didn't have to wait long. The very next day, while opening the blinds in the living room, I saw the van in the driveway during daylight for the first time. When I looked up toward the windows of the house next door, the man was standing at one of them. He was positioned perfectly still, staring directly at me with the same blank expression he had the night he caught me watching. It felt like he had been waiting for the blinds to open as if he knew exactly when I would do it. I expected him to look away, but he didn't. His eyes didn't even flicker. The stare lasted long enough that I felt something tighten in my stomach. When I got my wife and brought her back to see, he was gone. This was enough for me. We tried knocking on his door again, more forcefully this time, but there was no answer. I heard a heavy thud from inside the house, just one, sharp and solid, but nothing else. The silence afterward was worse than any reply he could have made. I went to Gene's house again. He opened the door and asked if I had seen his message. I hadn't. He told me he had heard a muffled crying noise outside the night before, coming from the new neighbor's direction. Not yelling, not pain, just a low, steady cry. He didn't know if it was an animal or a person. He didn't want to investigate alone. Together, we tried knocking on the new neighbor's door one more time. Me, my wife, Gene, and Gene's wife. No answer, no sound. The house felt sealed from the inside, airtight and lifeless. The next morning, the van was gone, and it stayed gone. 2 weeks have passed since then, and the house remains dark. Every few nights, my wife or I wake up because we think we hear something outside, but when we check, the driveway is empty. There is no sign of him anywhere, not a single clue about when he left or where he went. Still, some nights I swear I hear faint metal scraping echoing from the detached garage. Gene claims he hears it too. Neither of us have gone inside, though the thought crosses my mind more often than I'd care to admit. The truth is simple and unsettling. None of us ever learned his name. None of us know what he kept in that garage or why he refused to speak to anyone. But the pattern of movements, the noises, the late night presence in our yard, and the strange muffled crying left a clear impression. He was hiding something in that garage, and whatever it wasn't a tool, a project, or an animal he cared for. He avoided us because he didn't want anyone close to the truth. When the tension grew too high and too many eyes were on him, he left before anyone could force a real confrontation. What sits with me now is the fact that the garage is still locked from the outside. He didn't open it before leaving. He didn't empty it. He didn't clear out anything inside. He simply drove off and didn't return. I keep thinking about the scraping, the thumping, the crying, and the night someone ran out of my yard with desperate speed. I think about how the noises stopped abruptly once he knew we were paying attention, and I think about how fast he pulled away the night I tried to say hello. I don't believe he moved away permanently. People like him don't just leave. They retreat, wait for the attention to fade, then come back when no one is watching anymore. Until then, that garage remains locked, and whatever was in there remains sealed inside. I filed an anonymous report last week. It was the only thing that made sense. Now I just wait for someone with a key, someone with authority, to open that garage door and finally show us what we were living next to. I moved into my apartment in a quiet suburban complex late in the summer. At first, everything seemed normal enough. The buildings were old but well kept, the grass trimmed, and the neighbors polite but distant. I liked that. I had never been a fan of busy, social communities. I valued my privacy. But then there was the neighbor. He lived in the unit directly across from mine. At first, I barely noticed him. He was older, probably in his 60s, always dressed in loose, faded clothing. He didn't talk much, and I never saw anyone else visit him. His door was always closed, his blinds always drawn, and there was something about the way he moved. Slow, careful, deliberate, that felt off, even in a place full of people who kept to themselves. It started with small things. I'd notice him standing at his window, watching, but never moving his gaze when I walked by. At first, I thought I was imagining it, but over the weeks it became a pattern. Sometimes, he would be leaning just slightly out of the window when I came home, his eyes tracking me as I unlocked my door. I would freeze, wait for him to look away, and then quickly step inside. Inside, I would try to dismiss it, telling myself I was being paranoid. Then the noises started. I live on the second floor, and his apartment was directly opposite mine. At first, it was subtle, scraping sounds against the walls, soft footsteps pacing in his apartment at odd hours. Sometimes, I would hear faint murmuring, almost like muttered words, though I never could make out what he was saying. It wasn't constant, but frequent enough that I started noticing the pattern, always at night, always when the building was quiet. One night, I woke up to a sharp noise, like something being dropped, followed by the sound of paper rustling. I froze in bed, straining to listen. It was coming from his apartment. The sound continued for a long time, a steady rustling, shuffling, like he was moving objects around. The strangest part was the occasional pause, followed by a whisper of movement so soft it could have been imagined. I lay there, my heart racing, and eventually exhaustion won. I fell asleep in fits, waking up again to check, only to find nothing visible, nothing tangible, just the sound. I started noticing odd patterns in his behavior during the day, too. He would leave the apartment, sometimes carrying what looked like a large bag, and walk slowly around the building or sit on a bench, watching people pass by. The bag was heavy, it seemed, judging by the way he clutched it tightly to his chest. I never saw him go far. He always came back after an hour or two. I could never tell what was inside, and the curiosity gnawed at me. Then there were the moments in the stairwell. I started taking the stairs more often, avoiding elevators because I felt safer moving quickly. But I noticed him sometimes waiting at the landing, motionless, staring down at me from above. I would hear the faint shuffle of his shoes before I saw him, the slow slide of his hands along the railing. He never spoke, never smiled, never acknowledged my presence. He just stood there, watching. I tried to keep track of my comings and goings, hoping to avoid him. I would leave for work early, return late, stay inside as much as possible, but he adapted. It felt like no matter what time I left or came home, he was there, sometimes just inside the blinds, sometimes outside, always moving slowly, deliberately, as if he knew exactly where I was at all times. It escalated. I started noticing small things missing. At first, it was minor, insignificant. My trash can, which I left by the curb for collection, would be moved slightly. Then it became more personal. I would leave packages near my door, and when I returned, they would be gone. I started leaving a notebook with random notes in a corner of my apartment, and when I checked, the pages had been shifted, scribbled on in tiny, almost illegible handwriting. The feeling of being watched became constant, like a weight pressing against my chest. I called the police once after a particularly bad night. I had come home to find my apartment door slightly ajar. Nothing had been stolen, nothing broken, but the feeling was suffocating. They came, checked the building, and found nothing. No signs of entry, no one hiding. They suggested it might be stress, paranoia, but I knew the truth. I had no proof, only the creeping dread that he was always there, always watching, always waiting. I started documenting everything, every time he appeared, every sound, every movement. I took notes, timestamps, photos when I could manage it without being obvious. The pattern was clear. He observed, he waited, he collected. Every scrap of my life he could see, he did. I started to realize the full scope of it one evening. I had been working late on my laptop, looking out the window across the courtyard. He was there, crouched in a way that allowed him to peer into my apartment. His movements were so deliberate, so controlled, that it was obvious he had done this countless times before. I had never imagined anyone could be so patient, so methodical. One night, I decided I couldn't take it anymore. I contacted a private investigator, someone who specialized in surveillance and neighborhood issues. I didn't want the police involved yet. I wanted evidence first. The investigator installed cameras in discreet places, covering my entry points, the corridor, and my window. Within a week, the footage was clear. He was entering my apartment while I was out, moving slowly, rifling through my things. Always careful not to make noise. Always careful to leave just enough evidence that it felt like he might not have been there at all. I watched, horrified, as he handled my belongings, leafed through my personal papers, and even peeked inside my drawers. Armed with this evidence, I finally went to the police. This time, they couldn't ignore it. They obtained a search warrant, entered his apartment, and found everything he had taken or moved from my apartment carefully stored and cataloged. He had been watching several neighbors for years, building mental profiles, noting habits, routines. It was chilling to see the notebooks filled with observations, sketches of layouts, and meticulous records of comings and goings. The sheer obsession was overwhelming. He was arrested and eventually charged with multiple counts of burglary. stalking, and invasion of privacy. The courts handled him with the seriousness he deserved. After the legal process, I moved to a different part of the city. The relief was immediate. For the first time in months, I could walk to my car without feeling eyes on me, sleep at night without the rustle of footsteps, and leave my apartment without planning escape routes. I changed my routines, reinforced my doors, and stayed vigilant, but the constant anxiety that had haunted me finally lifted. Looking back, the experience left scars, but it also taught me the importance of boundaries, awareness, and documenting concerns early. It was terrifying, not because of anything supernatural or unreal, but because it was real, deliberate, and targeted. The world can feel safe until someone proves that it isn't, and knowing that someone had studied every detail of my life left a mark I couldn't erase. But at least I survived it. I knew I had escaped something dangerous, something patient and calculating, and that realization alone was enough to make me cautious for the rest of my life. The apartment complex eventually installed new security cameras, improved lighting, and changed locks. Neighbors talked quietly about what had happened, some shaken, others relieved that the nightmare neighbor was gone. For me, the most lasting change was vigilance. I check my windows, lock my doors, and always trust my instincts. Sometimes, even years later, I catch myself glancing at a window across a quiet courtyard, my heart racing, just in case someone is watching. But at least now, I know how to respond, and I know I can protect myself. The nightmare ended and the world, slowly, felt safe again. The relief wasn't instant, but it was profound. I finally felt a sense of closure, a real ending to months of living in fear. And while I will never forget the way it felt to be watched, I also know that the situation had a resolution, a clear, tangible ending where justice was served, and I could reclaim my life without looking over my shoulder constantly. The fear is gone now, replaced with vigilance and a sense of control I never had before. I moved into that neighborhood in early spring, the kind of place where everything looked clean and quiet at first glance. The streets were lined with identical houses, each with neatly trimmed lawns, and the sidewalks were wide and well kept. I didn't know anyone when I first arrived. Most of the neighbors kept to themselves, which suited me fine. I had moved here for work, wanting a fresh start, and I liked the silence. At first, everything seemed normal. People waved when I passed by, and there were occasional small gatherings in yards or driveways, but nothing that drew much attention. Life felt calm, predictable, and safe. Then I noticed him. I'm not exactly sure when I started paying attention, but it was subtle at first. There was a man living a few houses down, alone, I think. I never saw anyone else with him. He didn't talk to anyone outside of quick waves that barely qualified as greetings. His yard was strange. Not unkempt, exactly, but nothing like the rest of the neighborhood. There were odd piles of wood, rusted tools, and sometimes broken furniture stacked near the fence. The lawn wasn't dead, but it looked like it had been trampled by someone pacing or moving things back and forth. At first, I thought he was just eccentric, the kind of person who kept to himself and didn't care much about appearances. That was fine. I first really felt uneasy the night. I stayed up late working on a report. My window faced the street, and I had the blinds open just a bit. Around midnight, I noticed a shadow moving outside his front yard, flickering in the dim light of his porch lamp. At first, I assumed it was just him walking around. But it wasn't. The movement was deliberate, precise, like he was watching something, or someone. He lingered near his fence line, not moving toward his house, just standing there in a rigid stance that looked unnatural. I stared at him for a long time, frozen, wondering if I should call the police, but it was nothing illegal. Or at least nothing I could prove. Eventually, I closed the blinds, telling myself I was overreacting. Over the next few weeks, I started noticing patterns. He would be outside late at night, always near the fence watching. Sometimes he would appear in the early morning, crouched near a bush, peering into yards. I saw him once standing at the corner of the street, just staring down the road as if he knew when someone was leaving. What made it worse was how quiet he was. No doors opening and closing loudly, no car noises, no dogs barking. He was just there, moving slowly, sometimes crouching or bending in ways that didn't seem normal. I began noticing him watching me specifically. I would leave for work, and there he'd be, standing near his driveway, motionless. I'd come back late, and he would be in the same spot watching. It wasn't every day, but often enough to make my skin crawl. I started taking small precautions. I installed extra lighting around my house, leaving motion sensors on the sides and back. I kept curtains closed at night. I made sure not to walk around outside after dark. But even during the day, I noticed him sometimes leaning out of his window, watching my house. There were times I thought I caught him taking pictures, though I could never be sure. The feeling of being watched was constant, subtle at first, then growing into something heavier, like a presence in the air around my home. I stopped inviting friends over. I stopped leaving my car out in the driveway for long periods. The fear wasn't loud, it was quiet, creeping in through the edges of my life. One night around 2 a.m, I woke to a noise outside. It was faint at first, like scraping metal against pavement. I froze, my heart pounding. I listened carefully. The noise repeated, moving around the front of my house. I got up slowly, careful not to make any sound. I peeked through the blinds and saw him again, crouched low, carrying what looked like a long metal pipe. He moved slowly, methodically, checking the side of my house and the front yard. My hands were shaking so badly I almost dropped my phone. I thought about calling the police, but worried about what I would even tell them. I didn't want to look crazy, explaining that my neighbor was stalking me silently at night with a metal pipe. I waited, barely breathing, until he finally moved away. I could hear him moving down the street, the sound of his footsteps sharp against the pavement. I called the police, trying to explain as calmly as possible what had been happening. They sent an officer around the next morning, but by the time they arrived, he was gone. There was no sign of forced entry, no damage, no one to question. They said they would patrol, but it didn't feel like enough. After that, I started documenting everything. Every time I saw him watching, every time I thought I heard him outside, I wrote it down with dates and times. I started installing security cameras around my property, trying to capture something concrete. It was during this time that I noticed subtle signs in the neighborhood. Other people seemed wary of him too. A few neighbors mentioned feeling uneasy, noticing him moving around at odd hours. One neighbor said she had seen him staring at her backyard through a window once. Nobody knew who he really was, where he came from, or if he had any criminal record. Months passed, and the tension grew. Every small sound at night made me jump. Every shadow outside made my stomach tighten. I started sleeping with a baseball bat by the bed, even though I knew I wouldn't confront him unless I had to. I felt trapped in my own home, knowing that someone could be watching from a few houses down, silently observing every move. It affected everything. My work, my relationships, my sense of peace. I felt like a prisoner in my own life. Then one morning, things changed. I came home to see a moving truck outside his house. The house looked abandoned, the piles of wood gone. The yard cleared. I watched as movers carried out boxes, loading them carefully onto the truck. I didn't see him. I didn't even know if he had left. A note was left in the mailbox by the management company. He had sold the house suddenly, moving out without warning. I felt a strange mix of relief and disbelief. For months, he had been a constant source of fear, and now, just like that, he was gone. The relief was immediate. I slept through the night without fear for the first time in months. I walked around my yard freely, left my doors unlocked for a few hours just to feel normal again. I started seeing neighbors outside more, feeling part of the street instead of on edge. I realized how much the fear had consumed me, how it had made me feel powerless in my own home. Over time, the memory of him watching faded, leaving only a sharp lesson about paying attention, trusting instincts, and taking steps to protect myself. The neighborhood went back to its quiet rhythm, and I finally felt like I belonged there again. Even now, years later, I remember him. Not with panic, but with a careful awareness. That kind of presence, silent, patient, unsettling, leaves a mark. It reminds you that danger doesn't have to be loud or obvious to feel real. It can sit just a few houses down, moving slowly, waiting, and the only way to reclaim your life is to take back control step by step until normalcy returns.